I'm Grant. I serve as the chairman of a beverage manufacturer group with branches all across the country. As I reflect on the path that led me to this seat, I let out a deep sigh. I gaze at the photos displayed in the chairman's office and recall the promise I made with Ryan, captured in one of them. Let's become the most powerful, but also the kindest adults. Ryan and I, who grew up in the same children's home, made that promise before we had even graduated elementary school. It was our vow to give back to the facility that raised us. Back then, as children, we put our whole hearts into drafting a contract. That contract is still taped behind the framed photo of Ryan and me in the chairman's office. To fulfill that promise, we worked hard both in our studies and our student lives. Whenever one of us felt like giving up, we would reread that contract. And now, while I serve as the chairman of the beverage manufacturer group, Ryan is the president of its largest subsidiary. As we worked together to expand the company, Ryan one day told me, "You should be at the top, Grant." Ryan is kind. His reason for making that suggestion lay in the circumstances that led both of us to the children's home. Ryan had lost both of his parents. He had no siblings. On the other hand, my mother was still alive. She had frail health, and when she became a single parent, she wasn't sure if she could support me financially, so she placed me in the facility. I have no idea what happened to her after that. For the first 6 months, she visited me every month, but within a year, all contact was lost. Ryan once smiled sadly and said, "Even if I build wealth, I have nowhere to leave it except for the facility." When I argued that I was in the same situation since I didn't know where my mother was either, Ryan shook his head firmly. More than anyone, Ryan wished for me to reunite with my mother. Then, Ryan made another proposal. He said, "Let's keep your identity and background as hidden as possible while running the business. I'll be the public face. You wouldn't want to carry the doubt that, after 20 years apart, your mother only came back for the money, right?" Ryan joked as he said this. But immediately after, he looked down and muttered, "That would be too heartbreaking." Even so, it was hard for me to accept his proposal. Ryan was better than me in academics, he was more respected by juniors in club activities, and he had earned the trust of teachers. He had even served as student council president. Yet, Ryan patiently explained to me many reasons why I should be at the top. If I were the top and you were beneath me, it would be hard to justify why you're hiding your identity. When the company grows, it might seem like favoritism toward a subsidiary president. But if you're the chairman of the entire group and naturally hard to meet, people will just accept it as normal. Ryan listed many other benefits, but this was the one that resonated with me the most. Ryan was admired by more people than I was. So, if he said it made sense, then I just went along with it without thinking too deeply. And now that the company has grown, I realize Ryan was right all along. No one questions the fact that I, as chairman, keep my face hidden. It has no negative impact on business. However, as the president of a subsidiary, Ryan has no choice but to show his face in many situations. He can't be the only one absent from the monthly meetings with the other subsidiaries. It's been a long journey to get here. Looking at the photo of Ryan and me shaking hands, I can't help but let out a deep sigh. But my sigh isn't just from remembering the struggles we endured along the way. I could never have made it here alone. It was Ryan who brought me to this point. Now, our company has grown into a major corporation with an annual revenue of $624 million. We have more than 10 subsidiaries. I lean back into the leather sofa and close my eyes. What can I give back to Ryan? I still don't have an answer. Ryan has given me so much. My position, my wealth, and my mindset as a business leader. And yet, I have nothing to give him in return. I feel bad. I let out another sigh. It was filled with frustration at my own powerlessness. There was nothing I could do for Ryan, who could handle everything on his own. People may not know my face, but I know my employees. I believe that just sitting in the chairman's office buried in paperwork isn't enough to truly support the company. That's why I visit the subsidiaries almost every day. Rotating through our 10+ subsidiaries means I can visit each one at least twice a month. Of course, no one can realize I'm the chairman. While I was struggling with how to do this, Ryan prepared a janitor's uniform for me. Back in college, we both worked part-time at the same cleaning company. The owner of that company, who knew about our ambitions, was happy to provide the uniform. After finishing my paperwork in the morning, I put on the uniform in my office. In the afternoons, I visit the subsidiaries and listen to the employees, rather than setting up suggestion boxes or increasing formal meetings. I believe that overhearing conversations among colleagues gives me a much clearer picture of each company's reality. But the only reason I can do this is because no one knows what I look like. Hardly anyone knows who I really am, maybe just a few people who worked hard with me when the company was founded. Today, I visited a new subsidiary we established 3 months ago that specializes in alcoholic beverages. As I was polishing a stain off the marble at the front desk, a familiar voice reached my ears. "You blend in as well as ever." I was standing on a stepladder, and Ryan was a short distance away. Ryan looked up at me and gave a small wave. "Good afternoon. You look all gloomy. What's up? You hungry or something?" I quickly folded up the stepladder and slung it over my shoulder. Then, while checking his watch, Ryan casually said, "Now that I think about it, I haven't had lunch either." I took his hand. Without stopping, I rushed into the elevator and headed for the rooftop. To access the rooftop, you need a security card that grants entry to the top executive floor. The only 2 people who hold this card at all times are Ryan and me. Even the presidents of our subsidiaries must check out a security card from the security office every morning and return it at the end of the day. All of this is to protect my anonymity. It's not the most efficient system, but as the company has grown, I feel that stronger security is necessary. Ryan and I have lived our lives trusting no one but each other. Even the caregivers at the children's home we were grateful for, but we could never fully trust them from the bottom of our hearts. It may seem pathetic that we can't even trust our own employees, but that's just how it is. In return, we are prepared to take full responsibility if anything ever goes wrong in our company. As the elevator doors open, I quickly scan the floor to make sure no one is around. As we climbed the stairs at the end of the corridor to the rooftop, I heard a small chuckle from behind. "You don't have to be so cautious." If an external janitor and a subsidiary president are casually chatting, no one will think anything of it. They'll just assume we get along because we're close in age and find it amusing. If it's just small talk, that's fine. But if anyone overheard the kind of conversation we were having, it wouldn't be surprising if they started digging. You always worry about the strangest things. Ryan leaned on the railing, gazing into the distance. Tokyo's skyline stretched before us, filled with towering buildings. We had climbed high enough to lease out an entire building in this city. It still didn't feel real, but it was undeniable. So, what happened? After letting the wind wash over him for a while, Ryan finally spoke. "You didn't drag me up here just to complain, did you?" "As expected. I can never keep anything from you. If you just wanted to vent, you could have left, given me a call, and we'd hash it out over drinks tonight. No need to carry that heavy stepladder or risk someone seeing you rush up here." Ryan shot me a sidelong glance, smirking slightly. I often wonder what kind of man Ryan would have become if we hadn't made that childish contract back then. If I had to guess, a detective or a police officer. He used to read a lot of mystery novels, after all. It's about the confectionery company we launched last year. I leaned my stepladder against the rooftop entrance and stood beside him. When I started talking, Ryan gave a slight nod and said, as if he already knew what I was going to say. "Yeah, I've been looking into it too. The employee retention rate is low." As expected of Ryan. Ryan wasn't just keeping track of his own company, he was aware of what was happening across the entire group. We both had the same 24 hours in a day, yet he accomplished far more than I did. When I nodded vaguely, Ryan let out a bitter chuckle. Even my useless feelings of inferiority were obvious to him. The company was founded last year, and this year was its first time hiring new graduates, right? Yet, half of them quit before even receiving their mid-year bonuses in the summer. You visited that company last week, didn't you? Did you find anything? I shook my head slightly. But I did spend 2 hours watching the break room, and not a single person came in. It felt odd, like they were all being too serious. I sighed, muttering, something's definitely wrong there. Well, it's still a young company. Maybe they're just too conscious of being watched and can't relax yet. I'll check it out next week, but for now, my thoughts are just based on numbers. I'm counting on you. Don't make that pathetic face. You're the head of a major corporation, remember? Ryan lightly tapped my shoulder with his fist. I can't help it. I was never meant to be a leader. You didn't even cry when your mother stopped visiting. You're stronger than anyone. Have some confidence. His clenched fist loosened, settling on my back. I could feel his warmth seeping through. From the moment I was placed in that facility until now, I have never once shed a tear. Every child in the facility had, at least once, cried from loneliness. Even Ryan had spent many nights crying when he first arrived. But I never cried. Or rather, I couldn't. Ryan had trusted me enough to show me his tears. And while I trusted him just as much, maybe it was my pride as someone who had been there before him. Or maybe I was afraid that if I let myself cry, Ryan wouldn't feel safe enough to do so anymore. Eventually, I stopped even feeling lonely. It just happened naturally. I never consciously held back my tears. Yet here Ryan was, praising me for it. A faint trace of loneliness lingered on Ryan's face. I just want people to enjoy their work as much as possible. For all your distrust, you still see them as comrades, don't you? Even though I can't trust them. We both chuckled bitterly at ourselves while gazing down at the employees below from the rooftop. It seemed they were returning from lunch. Small groups formed as they walked back into the building. It was the same at the facility. Maybe because it was a relatively large children's home, kids often formed groups to play together. And we always watched them from a distance. If invited, we'd join in, but more than anything, we wanted to spend as much time as possible studying. Trust is complicated. I muttered, and Ryan responded with a half-hearted, "Yeah, it is." Back then and even now, nothing had changed in how we saw the world around us. We wanted to become the most powerful yet the kindest. That was all. It wasn't that we didn't want to join the circle, we just wanted to grow up faster. I glanced at Ryan beside me. He still had that same boyish expression from back then. And somehow, that reassured me I wasn't alone in this. The alarm bells in my mind told me this couldn't go on forever, but for now, I chose to ignore them. I had entered the children's home about 2 months before Ryan. Around the time Ryan stopped crying at night, my mother stopped visiting. "Grant, you're always so full of energy." Ryan used to say that to me often. It felt like he was indirectly asking, "Aren't you lonely?" By then, I had already forgotten what loneliness felt like. But there was one day when I couldn't bring myself to smile. It was Christmas, which is also my birthday. Every year, the facility put up a massive Christmas tree. It stood in the atrium of the 3-story building, and beneath it, presents for all the children were placed. I hated seeing everyone gather around that tree on Christmas Day. I never felt lonely even after my mother stopped visiting because I had a promise with her. For the 6 months she came to see me, she would always say, "I'm sorry I couldn't bring you anything," while stroking my hair with a sad, apologetic look. But she also said, "Christmas is your birthday, Grant. I'll do my best to be here that day." I believed her. I didn't need her to come all the time. Just Christmas. I was sure she would come for that. That belief kept me from feeling lonely. And as Christmas after Christmas passed without her, I gradually forgot what loneliness even was. Of course, my mother never came. Not once. Until I graduated middle school, I spent every Christmas, from Christmas Eve to Christmas night, sitting under that tree. The staff didn't like it since they needed to arrange the presents, but they knew my situation, so no one forced me to go back to bed. I don't want presents. I just want to see Mom and smile with her. At some point, I started hanging that wish on the tree like a letter. While the kids at the facility laughed at me, saying, "It's not like your wish comes true on Christmas, you know." Ryan was the only one who stayed with me and fell asleep under the tree. Haven't thought about that in a while. I woke up in my apartment bedroom, my pillow drenched in sweat. It seemed the air conditioning had turned off at some point. When I had just left the facility, I often dreamed of sitting under that Christmas tree with Ryan. But in the hectic days that followed, I had gradually forgotten. Ryan and I had earned our positions through countless moments of frustration and loneliness. That's exactly why we couldn't stand seeing anyone struggling in the company we built our fortress. Maybe it's a reminder not to forget. I turned on the air conditioning, but the sweat cooling on my skin only made me more awake. The clock showed it was almost 5 a.m., but beyond the curtains, the sky was still dark. Summer was coming to an end. I pulled my planner from my bag. Today's date had a circle around it. I had marked it myself last week, after talking with Ryan on the rooftop. Today, we were heading to the subsidiary in question. And on the morning of such an important day, I happened to dream about Christmas for the first time in years. It felt as if my past self was telling me, "Get it together," giving me a wake-up call. The rising sun stunned my sleep-deprived eyes. There are quite a few people still here. The office trash collection begins during lunch break. To prevent workload imbalances and ensure that no one is forced to skip their break, our company requires all employees, except executives, to take lunch at the same time. During that period, computers automatically shut down. For the sales department, where meetings with clients require flexibility, employees can request to disable the system in advance. But even during my last visit, I noticed that this confectionery company had more employees staying at their desks during lunch than any other subsidiary. And it seemed like that number was only increasing. "Excuse me for interrupting your work," I murmured softly while moving between office trash bins, collecting garbage. At the same time, I carefully observed the employees' expressions. And then, I found myself speechless. Every single employee who remained at their desk during lunch had a dark, tired look on their face. Their complexion was pale, and they all seemed completely drained. "Excuse me." I gave a small bow as I left the floor and spotted Ryan standing down the hallway. He glanced at me, signaling with his eyes. I gave a small nod and, after confirming that no one was around, headed toward the rooftop. Is it because they're understaffed? Everyone looks exhausted. No, this company was created to handle child-targeted products and relieve the workload of an existing confectionery division. It should actually have one of the lightest workloads in the group. The original company that handled this work never had employee retention issues. And I don't remember seeing this many people skipping lunch there. Ryan and I exchanged glances, both frowning. If there had been major changes in clients or workload, it would have come up in company meetings, and Ryan would be aware of it. The trash volume is oddly low, too. Is that a problem? If so many people are skipping lunch breaks, you'd expect to see trash from lunchboxes or snacks in the office. But there's barely anything. It's like they don't even have time to eat. "Grant, look at this." It was the moment when Ryan and I casually glanced at the cart where we had collected the trash. Ryan's tone changed. What Ryan picked up from the cart was a single piece of paper. It looked like a torn corner of a document, with a hastily scrawled message, "Another 3-day deadline?" Impossible. There haven't been any reports about unreasonable deadlines from clients in the meetings. Maybe they didn't think it was worth reporting. No, if clients keep demanding short deadlines and most employees are skipping lunch because of it, that's a serious problem. Ryan flipped the paper over. It appeared to be part of an expense report, with a name written on it, Keith. Either the admin staff handling the expenses or this Keith from the sales department wrote this. Considering this trash came from the sales floor, it's probably Keith's frustration written in the moment. Ryan and I exchanged glances once more. Then, at the same time, we nodded. We were clearly thinking the same thing. I never thought the chairman dosed the cleaning of the office. After finding the memo, we called Keith, the man we assumed had written it, to the rooftop. We wanted to hear what was going on before things got out of hand. Ryan and I were in full agreement, so we personally went to the sales department to fetch him. No one would dare refuse an order from Ryan, who held almost the same authority as the chairman. Keith didn't resist, and he came without hesitation. And then, I need to preface this by saying that this is one of the most confidential matters in the company. With that, I revealed my true position to him. I apologize if it seems like we're secretly investigating. No, I'm actually grateful to know that the chairman cares so much about the company. Thank you. Keith bowed deeply, but his expression remained troubled. Ryan sent me a look. I nodded and handed Keith the memo we had found. We'd like to ask about this note. That. I waited for Keith to speak as his eyes suddenly started darting around. The silence was finally broken by his deep sigh. Then, hugging his shoulders, he slumped down on the spot. I knew someone would notice eventually. I just didn't expect it to be from a note I couldn't swallow down. Please, don't tell Mr. Thompson. Thompson? That was the name of this subsidiary's president. Ryan and I had discussed him earlier. When we decided to spin off the children's confectionery division into a separate company, Mr. Thompson volunteered to lead it. He had been the head of that division in the original company, and since there were no objections, we had appointed him. I looked at Ryan, and he wore the same expression of disbelief. Neither of us had expected Mr. Thompson's name to come up here. Is Mr. Thompson mismanaging the company? Ryan asked carefully. Keith hesitated before murmuring, it's not exactly mismanagement. It might not even be reflected in the sales, so I'm not sure. Everyone was that busy just because it didn't count as sales? Is he embezzling? As I remained confused, Ryan's voice and expression returned to a calm state. Keith gave a small nod at Ryan's words. It started with just one or two requests. Mr. Thompson asked for some confectionery to be urgently arranged for his neighborhood association's event. And was that recorded as a sale? No, because it was a small quantity, we categorized it as a sample. The factory rushed the order, and we delivered it in 2 days. Keith stood up weakly. But then, the requests escalated. Now, we're sending quantities equivalent to stocking an entire store to Mr. Thompson's house and his relatives' homes within just 2 or 3 days. How frequently? Almost every day. This month, he claimed it was a donation to his child's school. So I've been going to the factory every day to beg for rushed orders. He doesn't want to take everything directly from the factory or warehouse, as that might raise suspicion. So we've been collecting leftover samples from our business partners to secure the necessary quantities. But we still have our own sales responsibilities. And it's gotten to the point where the entire sales department is handling Mr. Thompson's requests. Whether or not these products are reflected in the company's sales figures, I can't say for sure. But one thing is certain, they aren't being counted toward the sales department's performance. The sales department's performance was poor in the last half year, wasn't it? Ryan and I exchanged a knowing look. Keith bit his lip. The bonuses were low, so I had a feeling something was wrong. But we couldn't just ignore Mr. Thompson's requests. The sales director even tried to bring it up with him, but Mr. Thompson simply asked, "Who do you think decides your salaries and bonuses?" Keith's hands curled into fists. He clenched them tightly, as if swallowing his frustration, before finally loosening his grip. But now, I've had enough. If this keeps up, both the company and its people will fall apart. I'll speak up at the next meeting. No, we'll handle it. They'll start looking for who talked to you too. Either way, I won't be able to stay in the company anymore. Keith interrupted me and bowed his head, saying, "Thank you for listening." His expression looked as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. I used to love seeing kids happily take the sweets I planned and delivered to the register. I was proud to be part of this company. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his face turning red as he tried to hold them back. Ryan and I exchanged glances. Then, without a word, we both nodded. Once again, we were thinking the same thing. "Keith, when is the next meeting?" 3 days from now, at 1 p.m. Good. That gives us enough time. Keith tilted his head in confusion, unable to keep up with our conversation. "I can get a janitor's uniform for you too, Ryan." "Nah, I'll go in a suit." It seemed we had both envisioned the same scenario. We laughed, then immediately began planning for 3 days from now. According to Keith, Mr. Thompson made his requests to the sales department during lunch breaks. And moreover, he seems to misunderstand the fact that taking a lunch break means they have free time, and he often leaves remarks saying, "If you have time to eat lunch, then this should be easy, right?" The fact that he specifically avoided making requests during work hours showed he had no intention of logging these tasks as official sales. Each floor of every subsidiary had a break room. It was installed so employees could make coffee during late nights or when they couldn't take a proper lunch break. Separately, on the first floor, there was a courtyard with many tables and benches arranged. It was set up to reduce the burden of lunchtime inside the office. I'm glad I got to see this during lunch. Seems like employees from other departments use it too. More than I expected. I usually spend lunchtime collecting trash from each floor. I had no idea the courtyard was this lively. Ryan and I had put a lot of thought into these spaces, hoping they would be useful for employees. Seeing them actually being enjoyed made me smile under my mask. For once, I guess I should thank Mr. Thompson for letting me see this. The words, spoken under my mask, never reached anyone's ears. I let my gaze wander, searching for my target. There he is. Mr. Thompson was strolling through the courtyard, glancing around as if looking for someone. Just as Keith had told us, he was most likely searching for a sales employee. Keith had also given us one more useful piece of information. Mr. Thompson always buys coffee, a sandwich, and soup from the convenience store. He eats them along with the homemade lunch his wife prepares for him. Keith had been puzzled as to why we wanted to know this. But Ryan and I had exchanged a triumphant fist bump upon hearing it. Just as Keith had said, I approached Mr. Thompson, who was holding a coffee in his right hand and a cup of soup in his left. The story Ryan and I had created couldn't begin without first clashing with Mr. Thompson. I nudged his right elbow with my arm while pushing the cart. Losing his balance, Mr. Thompson accidentally mixed his coffee into his soup and glared at me, shouting, "Watch it." Step 1: Contact established. I quickly scanned the area. Several employees met my gaze and gave me small nods. Among them was Ryan, disguised with a simple mask and glasses. The others were longtime employees who had been with the company since its founding. All of them now held executive positions in other subsidiaries. My apologies, sir. I pulled my cap down lower over my face and bowed. Then, Mr. Thompson's low voice rumbled over my head. "Hey, you're that janitor I always see, right?" Got him. Under my mask, I let a smirk creep onto my lips. "Yes, sir. I've been working here for quite some time. Then you understand my position, don't you?" "Of course." "Mr. Thompson." "That's right. I am the president." Feeling pleased with my humble attitude, Mr. Thompson smirked. It was an ugly, smug grin. A part of me felt disappointed seeing how he had changed. If you understand that, then this will be quick. Do you have any idea how much my suit costs? I wouldn't know, sir. Of course you wouldn't. A janitor's salary could never afford something like this. Look at this, your fault. You got coffee on my suit. He gestured with his chin toward the stain. Sure enough, there was a small, dark smudge. But it was so minor that it would probably come off easily. And now, my coffee and soup are ruined too. And what would you like me to do about it? Wow, janitors really are slow on the uptake, huh? I'm saying you need to pay for it. Mr. Thompson sneered at me, his voice thick with condescension. By now, a crowd had gathered around us. Among them, I spotted the sales director and Keith. Mr. Thompson turned to the sales director. Hey, you agree with me, don't you? But the director simply lowered his head and said nothing. Hey, I'm talking to you. Don't ignore me. Maybe he just didn't hear you? What? A small stain, a $5 lunch, not hearing a single voice in this crowded place. They're all minor things. If you can't even let such trivial matters go, are you really a president? I step in front of Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson's hand, still holding the ruined drinks, was trembling. From rage, no doubt. When I looked up, I saw his face had turned bright red. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Of course. You're Mr. Thompson, aren't you? You lowly janitor, talking back to me like that. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Even though I had disguised my appearance, I hadn't changed my voice. I spoke at every annual New Year's address and in messages at employee orientation. Someone was bound to recognize it. Sure enough, I heard a whisper. Chairman? Mr. Thompson, however, remained completely oblivious. He was so caught up in his own anger that he didn't even notice the shift in the atmosphere. Was it the way Ryan and I handled personnel decisions that left Mr. Thompson so isolated? Had our judgment in appointing him isolated him this much? I swallowed back a sigh, but Ryan, beside me, who wore the same conflicted expression, let out a deep one in my place. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, what Ryan and I can do is correct Mr. Thompson's mistakes and help the employees who are holding back their tears. I clenched my fist and lifted my gaze. Facing Mr. Thompson head-on, I spoke firmly. It doesn't matter if you're a janitor or a president. We're all here working toward the same goal to make this company better. We're equals. Who would ever follow a leader who doesn't respect their own people? You arrogant little, what do you know? Mr. Thompson's trembling arm shot up. The moment I saw it swing forward, something warm splattered against my head. Janitors should know their place. His voice rang in my ears. I twitched my nose, and the mixed scent of coffee and soup filled the air. The cup clutched in Mr. Thompson's hand was empty, while he laughed in front of me. Are you okay, Grant? Ryan and the other executives, who had been watching our exchange, raised their voices in concern. Mr. Thompson, what did you? How could you do this to the chairman? Ryan's exaggerated performance almost made me laugh at the absurdity of it. The thought that even Ryan wasn't capable of everything helped me regain my composure, easing the frustration I had been feeling. Mr. Thompson's face stiffened at Ryan's sudden appearance. The murmurs from the surrounding crowd grew louder. So he really is the chairman, and wait, Mr. Thompson didn't realize? Losing yourself to anger is one of your worst habits, Mr. Thompson. I removed my mask and cap, running my fingers through my wet hair. Finally, my voice seemed to reach Mr. Thompson. His frozen expression wavered as he struggled to maintain his composure, though it was clear he was failing. With his face pale and eyes filled with tears, Mr. Thompson furrowed his brows and crushed the cup in his hand with a crunch. Do you understand the situation now? I get it. But this is too much. You think I wanted this to happen? You all set me up. If you have something to say it to my face. I don't need this company, I can find a dozen others that want me. Oh? So you really want me to say it to your face? I took off my work jacket. The suit I wore underneath was now stained with coffee dripping from my hair. As I sniffed the stain, I could also pick up the scent of soup. My suit got ruined by filthy water. I stepped forward slowly, while Mr. Thompson instinctively took small steps backward, trying to put distance between us. Adjusting my collar, I stopped walking. Perhaps startled by my sudden halt, Mr. Thompson tripped and fell backward. I looked down at him and spoke. Well then, I suppose I should bill you for my suit. Ah. I hate to use your words against you. But a suit like this isn't something a newly appointed president's salary can afford. He must have recalled his own words just moments ago. His head lowered little by little. So, you can't afford to compensate me. In that case, I'll need a promise from you. A promise? At my words, his hand twitched slightly. Don't mix personal grudges with business. And never, ever do anything that would make your colleagues suffer. What are you talking about? The way you're reacting tells me you already know exactly what I mean. That's a relief. Whatever faint hope he had of escaping this situation must have crumbled. The strength drained from his body. He slumped completely, as if no further words could reach him. But I still had to say it. Because believing that my words would reach him someday, that was my duty as someone who stood at the top. If you want to lead, you need to value the people who work alongside you. If you can't do that, step down. I raised my right hand. Perhaps in response to my gesture, or maybe due to the overwhelming silence. Mr. Thompson slowly lifted his face. His eyes wandered toward the courtyard. And then, as he took in the situation, his expression shifted. His hand covered his mouth, his eyes widened in shock. The employees gathered in the courtyard, most of them watching the commotion with their phones raised. They were diligently recording everything, preserving the evidence. Among the crowd, there were likely people who had suffered under Mr. Thompson's leadership. I figured they immediately understood why Ryan and I were doing this. So many people have turned against you. And they were supposed to be your allies. Mr. Thompson tried to stand, but his legs failed him, and he collapsed back onto his knees. He had no strength left. Was this situation entirely Mr. Thompson's fault? If someone were to ask me that, I would shake my head. I glanced at Ryan, who slowly nodded back at me. He felt the same way. I took a step closer to the gathered crowd. In moments like this, Ryan was always the one to speak. I had left it to him for so long, so now my feet felt frozen in place. Who would believe the words of the chairman who only just showed his face now? Who would be moved by what I had to say? Doubt shook my body. But I lifted my head. In my mind, I pictured the contract we had signed that day. Mr. Thompson will no longer be given unreasonable demands. The hidden revenues will be thoroughly investigated, and the company's performance, as well as employee evaluations, will be reassessed fairly. This will never happen again. Wait a moment. A voice interrupted me. I turned to see Keith, his eyes brimming with tears. Just dealing with the past isn't enough to erase our suffering. If Mr. Thompson walks away without consequences, no one will accept it. Keith clenched his fists, trembling. I faced him, appreciating his courage to speak up. Mr. Thompson will be demoted to a regular employee. He will start over and learn from the ground up at Ryan's company. I understand that some people never want to see him again. I will ensure that is handled properly. Ryan stepped beside me and bowed his head. Mr. Thompson glanced between us, shifting his gaze back and forth. And then, he broke down in tears. Thank you, and I'm sorry. This situation isn't just about Mr. Thompson's shortcomings. It also happened because Ryan and I, as leaders, lacked experience and insight. I stepped closer to the crowd once more. No one was holding up their phones anymore. I am truly sorry for the hardship and trouble we have caused. I bowed deeply, very deeply. Thank you. A familiar voice rang out. That single statement seemed to signal the start. Applause erupted. Thank you, everyone. As I raised my head and spoke, the sound of clapping grew into a thunderous wave around Ryan and me. Months passed since the incident. Now, Ryan and I stood in the children's home we hadn't visited in a long time. The Christmas tree, which I hadn't seen in years, was still large, but it no longer held the same grandeur I remembered from childhood. If this shift in perception was what people called growing up, then maybe some parts of childhood should be allowed to remain untouched. That thought crossed my mind when, "Sorry to keep you waiting." A calm voice echoed through the hall, accompanied by the faint squeaking of a wheelchair. I turned toward the door. There stood Ryan, an unfamiliar woman, and an elderly woman in a wheelchair, pushed by the woman. It was my mother. Mother! At the sound of my voice, she lifted her face. It had been so long since I last saw this face that I couldn't even remember when our last meeting was. As always, my mother looked just like me. Staring at her, I was struck by the undeniable truth that she was my real mother. Yet, even as she lifted her head and looked at me, there was no reaction in her eyes. Her eyes can see, but it seems like her mind can't keep up. The one pushing my mother's wheelchair was a female staff member from the care facility where she now lives. A name tag on her chest read Tiffany. It all started when Tiffany saw the commotion on social media and reached out to my company. Apparently, one of the employees recording that day had been live streaming the entire event. From that moment until now, things had moved so fast that I hadn't even had time to process the idea of a heartfelt reunion. To be honest, I hadn't felt any surge of emotions up until now. So, reunions are a lot more subdued than I expected. I feel the same way. My emotions haven't caught up yet. Hearing our conversation, Tiffany spoke up. Your mother, Emily, had been working as a live-in employee at a small inn near our facility. She wanted to save as much money as possible so she could come back for her son. She used to say meeting her son again was the reward she was working toward. She didn't have to leave in the first place. More than me, no, more than anyone else here, Ryan had been the one who wished for this day to come. Yet, he directed a cold voice at my mother. At Ryan's words, Tiffany let out a bitter smile. I think you're absolutely right. And I'm sure Emily feels the same way. She gently adjusted the robe draped over my mother's shoulders. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of her frame, so thin, it startled me. I widened my eyes in shock, and Tiffany met my gaze. She smiled sadly. I sometimes wondered if the only thing keeping her alive until now was the hope of seeing you again. According to Tiffany, less than a year after starting her job at the inn, my mother's health deteriorated, and she was hospitalized. Her illness wasn't physical but rooted in her emotional state. She couldn't stay in the hospital indefinitely. So she eventually ended up at the care facility. She never left her room, just waiting for the days to pass. She gradually lost her strength, and now, even speaking has become difficult. Tiffany's voice trembled as she continued. Even turning over in bed on her own is a struggle now. This is her own fault. She left Grant behind, and it broke her. But Grant never even knew. If he had known his mother was suffering like this, he would have done something. He's a kind person. So don't say things that make it sound like he's to blame for not noticing. If that's how my words came across, I'm truly sorry. That wasn't my intention. It's just that it's been years since Emily has left the facility. She couldn't even give her consent to this visit, so in a way, I forced her out here on my own. If her condition worsens because of this, I will have to bear that guilt. No, I'm glad we got to meet. I appreciate you reaching out. And I meant it. I had already discussed this scenario with Ryan beforehand, what we would do if my mother reached out. Both of us had agreed. If she came back just for money, we would handle it accordingly. I recalled Ryan's words, if she tries to hurt you, I, along with the teachers, will protect you with everything we have. Before this meeting, Ryan and the teachers at the children's home had met with my mother. Ryan had only allowed this reunion to happen today because he had judged that it would be okay. I had braced myself for this ever since Tiffany's call. But in the end, neither Tiffany nor my mother had sought us out for personal gain. That alone was enough for me. Emily spends time every day staring at a photo of her son. During those moments, her expression somehow seems calmer. Tiffany's voice faltered. I was worried I might be a burden, but hearing you say that makes me feel relieved, she said, tears streaming down her face. I suddenly felt a hand on my back. It was Ryan. He gently pushed me forward, guiding me closer to my mother. I crouched down to meet her gaze. Mother. No, Mom. I called out to her the way I used to as a child. The words felt unfamiliar now, making me instinctively want to lower my gaze. But I fought against that urge. And then, my mother's fingers twitched slightly. Grant? A faint voice reached my ears. Tiffany leaned in toward my mother, her voice filled with urgency. Emily. Mom. Grant, you've grown so much. My mother smiled. It was the first time in so long that I had seen her smile, yet the tears in my eyes blurred my vision. Grant, are you crying? I turned toward the trembling voice. Ryan's eyes, too, were filled with tears. Why are you crying? Because I wanted you to let it out. To say that you were sad, that you were lonely. I didn't want you to keep it all bottled up. Ryan's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto his knees. Thank God. Thank God. His large frame shook with emotion. Grant, have you been doing well? My mother's frail hand reached for mine. Her grip was so weak, so fragile, that it felt like I could brush it away with the slightest movement. I held her hand back. And with my other hand, I rested my palm on Ryan's hunched back. Thanks to a very dear friend. I've always been happy. My mother slowly narrowed her eyes, her expression gentle. Then, she turned to Ryan and whispered, "Thank you." At those words, Ryan's body trembled even harder.